Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Adi, and today we have another Indianapolis team report, and I am joined by another top player. I am joined by Jeremy Rodriguez. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the channel. And so, for those who don't know you, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I guess I'll use Stefan Mott's description of me, which he told me after our finals match at Indianapolis Regionals. He said that I'm an old head, which is a little weird to think about, but I have been playing since 2014. That's 8 years on the scene. My first major accomplishment was actually winning the Indianapolis Regional Championship 2015 year, 2016 points season, back when it was in Fort Wayne. I did that with a different Assault Vest fire type. It was an Assault Vest Heat Ran back then. Over the years, I've had a couple other accomplishments. I took EV to a regional championship win in 2017, managed to win the 2018 North American International Championship with Driftbloom Tapu Lele, and had a bit of success in the Ultra Series format. This is my first major finish post-COVID, or really in the 2020 through 2022 season at all. So I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you're on the channel. The Driftbloom team that you used at 2018 Nationals was maybe one of my favorite teams from all of Gen 7. So really inspired me. And yeah, I guess let's talk about the team that you used. So you used this Calorix Ice Reshiram team to finish second place at Indianapolis Regionals this past weekend. Why Reshiram? Why Calorix Ice?
So this kind of gets back to an explanation I gave on stream, but I really wanted to test around with Cali Ice because it has a lot of stats, it has an incredibly broken spread move, and it just seemed that those combinations should make it a powerful pick in the metagame. Obviously, it has some issues with common Pokemon like Incineroar and Zacian, and the rest of the team is kind of meant to flesh out those issues, but I didn't think that they were insurmountable problems. Basically, in building the team, I started with the Cali Ice, the Regieleki, the Porygon 2, and the Incineroar. Obviously, if you're going Cali Ice, you're going to go Trick Room, and although the standard support option was Mimikyu, that just felt inflexible and kind of brittle to me. You know, if you can't get up a first Trick Room, you just don't have any sort of switching synergy, and you lose the game. If you do get up a first Trick Room, but your opponent manages to stall it out, once again, you find yourself in that same position where it's very, very difficult to win. Porygon 2, there have been games where I set up Trick Room, parting shot out with my Incineroar, get my Calyrex Ice on the field, click Glacial Lance, at the same time my Porygon 2 is recovering, Trick Room expires, and I've got a full HP Porygon 2 on the field with an Incineroar in the back. So it's very achievable to get a second or even a third Trick Room. Regieleki is fantastic just for applying offensive pressure and letting the team kind of shift modes. Actually, going back to the Driftbloom Tapu Lele team, I really like it when a team can play both offensively and defensively based on the lead combinations. So obviously, Tapu Lele was a very aggressive Pokemon, but that team also had an Amoonguss. And Amoonguss Lele Metagross could play kind of like a defensive core. The way I would put that into action with this team would be leading Regieleki next to Porygon 2 most frequently, with Calyrex Ice and either Reshiram or Incineroar on the back. And then if I want to Dynamax my Regieleki, start going for Max Lightning's turn 1, that's something I can do. Alternatively, I could Volt Switch out into Incineroar. I could Volt Switch out into Calyrex Ice. It just feels like there's a lot of flexibility there. Once we get past those first four, the last two changed a lot in testing. Initially, it was Zacian and Amoonguss, then it was Zacian Rillaboom, then it was Kyogre Rillaboom, then it was Palkia Amoonguss. Then I slapped on Reshiram because this was slightly after the EUIC, and obviously Gilgamesh had just done well with the combination of Calyrex Ice and Reshiram. So it seemed like it might be good. In testing, it wasn't. Reshiram was just awful in testing. And Tapu Fini was also kind of mid in testing. But I kind of thought that they were interesting Pokemon that had a lot of potential in the metagame. And so I didn't go into Indianapolis Regionals expecting to win. I went in with a team that I thought had a lot of potential in individual subsections and pairings, and I wanted to get a feel for how good they actually were to then leverage that knowledge at subsequent events.
Makes sense, I guess. We were talking a little earlier, and you said that your main focus is doing well at Worlds, and so having an understanding of how good these Pokemon are is really useful. And of course, you found out that they are very, very good as you got all the way to second place. But I guess this team is really unusual. Obviously, like you said, you saw it do well at European Internets, and then it really popped off at Indianapolis, where you and then Leonard and one other player all got top 16 with this sort of core with slightly different variants of it. Do you want to talk me through the Pokemon and what they do, and maybe how your team differs from the other teams that did well?
Sure. The other team was Colding Light, who was the top seed in Swiss, but then lost in top 16. He had Urshifu on his team, which I think is a very interesting choice. For me, I think I kind of play a fairly linear Trick Room game plan, although I'm not necessarily forced into it. With the Assault Vest Reshiram, I can deal some damage outside of Trick Room. With the Finny, I have the ability to just kind of spam heal pulses or Nature's Madness. So I'm not completely reliant on Trick Room or lose, at least not in the early game. Typical line would be leading Incineroar Porygon 2, Porygon 2 Reshiram, Incin Reshiram, with an idea of getting Trick Room set up somewhere in like the first 3 turns. And then I want to pivot so that I have my Calyrex Ice on the field. That can be achieved either by using Parting Shot, or one of the things I would like doing is setting up Trick Room and having my own Incineroar on the field. And then when there's an opposing Incineroar that I can say pretty confidently is going to Parting Shot out, what I'll do instead is just leave my Incin on the field, Throat Chop to prevent their Parting Shot, while I switch my Porygon 2 out into Calyrex Ice. That leaves them, kind of trapped and can produce some very nice positioning. The other nice thing about it is with the speed dynamics. My Incineroar is min speed, my Porygon 2 is 1 point faster, and my Cali Ice is 1 point faster than that. So both Foul Play and Throat Chop can be used to side proc my Cali Ice's weakness policy. Incineroar cannot critical hit Oko my Calyrex Ice. My Porygon 2 can critical hit Oko my Calyrex Ice. There was a game in Swiss where I traced an opposing Yveltal's Dark Aura. My Cali Ice got intimidated, and then I crit and just wiped it off the field. So I did not win that game, actually. 2 rounds in a row, my Porygon 2 KO'd my own Cali Ice. So that is one of the things to be wary of when using this team. But yeah, I think that's the long and short of it.
So do you know exactly how much Foul Play normally does to Calyrex Ice?
If I am at neutral attack, you're probably doing a little under 50% when you're not Dynamaxed and around 25% when you are.
Okay. That's like pretty reasonable. I remember you also brought this team, or a very similar version of this team, to your NPA semifinal match against Gavin. And we are, of course, on the same NPA team. We were all watching, and you went for a side Foul Play, and your Calyrex Ice lived on like 5 HP or something crazy like that. And you won the game because of it, and we were all popping off. But it sounds like you knew exactly how much damage that was going to do.
I was familiar with that damage calc. I was confident that I would live it. One of the big lessons of that set, actually, was the value of Tapu Fini. It can be hard for a lot of teams to find a 6th slot that really fits in and fills what the team is looking for, especially when you're using a more defensive or Trick Room oriented team in this format, or at least that's been my experience. Tapu Fini, like I said earlier, was not all that impressive in testing. It was helpful in the actual MPA set you referenced against King of Mars, Gavin, and he was running a Lunadon team. Anyone who followed Indianapolis Regionals will know that I played a Lunadon for my win in round 9 of Swiss versus Chongjun, and Tapu Fini was very helpful there as well. Throughout the day, though, it kind of proved its worth in a whole range of matchups. I played a number of Yveltal Zacian, and Fini was very nice there as just Dark Resist, something that could easily fire off Nature's Madnesses. And against the Assault Vest Yveltal variants in particular, I found that Mist was quite useful. Because you set up a Mist, suddenly Snarl doesn't lower your special attack, Max Darkness doesn't lower your special defense. These teams pivot around with Incineroar. Incineroar's not intimidating you. And the thing you quickly realize is once Mist is up, that team archetype, which really does care a lot about its stat drops, has incredible amounts of difficulty dealing with either of my restricteds alone. Not to say nothing about both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, can you talk me through the individual Pokemon on your team and why they are trained the way they are?
Okay, so let's start with Cali Ice and Reshiram as my restricteds. They had very simple goals: survive attacks and deal damage. I didn't have any super clear benchmarks in my mind for defensive calcs I wanted to live that I wouldn't do naturally with just max HP. So I went with simple 252, 252 spreads, and in my testing, I never regretted it, never wanted anything else. Porygon 2 is a specially defensive set. It is EV'd to live a Life Orb Max Geyser from Kyogre, which was somewhat popularized after it got second at the EUIC. Eerie Impulse is just the highest impact move you can really have in that fourth slot. For me, Trick Room and Recover just seemed mandatory. Foul Play was helpful for the synergy with my own Calyrex, the ability to hit opposing threats, including Zacian. You know, you're dealing a reasonable 25% to opposing Zacian, assuming they have their Intrepid Sword boost. And then Eerie Impulse was just useful primarily against opposing Kyogre, but you could also get mileage out of it versus opposing Yveltal, or in rare cases when for some reason you don't want to foul play an opposing Calyrex Shadow.
And how did you feel about Trace on the Porygon 2?
Trace was a mistake. If you are running this team, do not run Trace, run Analytic. Analytic is basically no ability at all, but no ability at all would be better than Trace. On some occasions, you Trace Intimidate, and that's cool. I traced Shadow Shield once, maybe, but it didn't wind up mattering at all. In my top cut sets, the fact that I was Trace and could potentially trace an opposing Drizzle when my entire matchup depended upon having Sun Up from my Reshiram's Max Flare made so many games so much more difficult than they needed to be. In testing, it never really came up because, I can't emphasize this enough. I did fairly limited testing with this team, but going forward, I would absolutely drop Trace. And then, it's just mostly a defense stump. Porygon 2 has incredible natural bulk, and combined with Incineroar's Intimidate, you're taking most things pretty comfortably. The Regieleki spread is pretty straightforward. It's max special attack to deal maximum damage. The speed allows you to outspeed Choice Scarf base 90s, primarily Choice Scarf Kyogre, but if you run into somebody running a Choice Scarf Groudon, you outspeed that as well. The HP allows you to live a 252 attack Jolly Zacian Behemoth Blade plus 1 turn of Life Orb if you are not Dynamax, or 2 turns of Life Orb if you are Dynamax. So that's pretty cool. Incineroar is EV to live Zacian's Sacred Swords when they're at +1. It's just generally nice to have defensive Incineroar in this format, in my opinion. I get to be Shuka Berry because I have Misty Terrain on my Finny, Misty Surge on my Finny. Back when this was a non-Finny team, I was Safety Goggles, but I really do like the switching ability that the Shuka Berry provides. Throat Chop is fantastic. It's not as great given how slow my Incineroar is, but I still got a fair bit of use out of preventing opposing Incineroar from going for Parting Shot when I had set Trick Room up, so I really like it. And I think Throat Chop is absolutely a better choice than Darkest Lariat. I've already touched on the speed dynamics between Cali Ice, P2, and Incineroar. And then that just brings us to Tapu Fini. I think Nature's Madness, Moonblast, and Heal Pulse are all pretty mandatory. The ability to deal 50% to Incineroar, 50% to Zacian, 50% to anything that's going to switch in on a given slot is just simply incredible. Moonblast gives you a form of damage after you've gone for Nature's Madness. It would be kind of silly to not have an attacking move and just have your Tapu Fini slowly lose to an opposing Incineroar because they just keep spamming Throat Chops or whatever. And it's also nice to hit Yveltal, which this team can have some difficulty against. Heal Pulse allows you to go for a super, super slow game with this team where you just keep pivoting, heal pulsing, pivoting, heal pulsing. That's what I did, I think, in my round 6. I actually wound up winning that round on time in game 3. If the game had gone on forever, I would have won there too, just because I had more resources than my opponent and could keep restoring HP in a way they couldn't. But the fact that the team can play such a slow, long game is something I really appreciate. And then the last move was kind of a toss-up. Ashton was really advocating for Haze, but I just couldn't think of enough situations in which I would actually want that or actually click it. And I love Mist. Mist is one of my favorite moves. The only problem I have with Mist is the opportunity cost of running it and setting it up. But it seemed as though this is a team that can really, really value Mist. And I didn't have anything else the Tapu Fini seemed like it needed. So I ran Mist, and I didn't regret it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we saw it come up in your top 4 match where it blocked a parting shot, which is really cool because not only does it stop the stat drops, but it also stops the pivoting effect. And yeah, I mean, stopping Intimidate is so big for Calyrex Ice. That's probably its biggest weakness. Stopping Amogus from putting it to sleep because it underspeeds it is huge. I think Tapu Fini really is one of the strongest partners. It kind of does everything that Calyrex Ice needs from a partner, albeit it is a very slow Pokemon, and that kind of gave you that ability to play a slower game. So, yeah, I mean, there's a joke. I think in the puppies as well as in a couple other discourse that I'm in, where no one actually knows what Tapu Fini is supposed to do on these teams. People keep testing them out. I think Leonard said that at one point when he was testing out this team. But I'm glad you managed to figure that out and really put it to good use.
Yeah, Tapu Fini is definitely a 6th Pokemon on this team. It's the last to be added, but I think its role is still valuable. And if you remove it, I think you start looking at a kind of fundamentally different team because the way you approach certain matchups is no longer the same.
Mm-hmm. And then I do have one question about the Reshiram. So you have 5 speed IVs. What is that for? And then also, I guess, did you ever consider any other moves? I'm not too familiar with its move pool.
So these 5 speed IVs were a little bit random. Long story short, I just wanted to be slower than most Rillaboom and faster than most Incineroar. 5 speed IVs puts me at a stat of 97, so I'm under the 100 kind of benchmark where even slower Rillaboom tend to hang around. And also slower primals tend to hang around. I guess they're not actually primals in this format, but you get what I'm saying. But 97 would be very, very fast for an Incineroar. Certainly there are some that go max speed Focus Sash, but I wasn't terribly worried about those sets. So it just seemed like a nice compromise to have my Reshiram hit that sort of stat. Blue Flare, Draco Meteor, and Earth Power all kind of felt mandatory. I kind of considered running Fusion Flare just to have that 100% accurate fire type option, but ultimately decided against it, both because, when I'm maxed, I'm just always going to be clicking Max Flare off of Blue Flare. And then also because, when I'm not maxed, I kind of felt like I needed to have the confidence that I was just going to hit my moves when I needed to, which wasn't actually always true throughout the course of a tournament. But one of the problems I've run into in the past is if you get too worried about running inaccurate moves, you'll just wind up creating a team that is solid but isn't actually going to win tournaments because, you're out here going for Scalds. Somebody out there is hitting their Hydro Pumps and they're dealing more damage, they're getting more wins, and they're moving up in the standings, ultimately more likely to win the event. Solar Beam, I didn't click at all until my top 8 set when I was able to max Overgrowth, Carson, Confers, Kyogre. It just seemed better than the other options. The only other option I really considered was Hyper Beam, which doesn't give you much coverage at all. It's just 150 base power. On some teams that can take advantage of the speed drops, I kind of understand and respect it. But for me, the speed drops are at best irrelevant and at worst actively harmful because, I max strike something outside of Trick Room. Opposing primals, if they're max speed Kyogre, for example, they still outspeed me. It's not helping. Opposing Charizard still outspeeds me. If I max strike one slot and they switch in like a Thunderous in the other, oh dear, I'm in trouble. So it just didn't feel helpful. Leonard was actually running Shadow Ball on his Reshiram, which is a fascinating option that I didn't consider at all, and is something I might look into in the future. I think I would still probably go with Solar Beam just because I do value the grass coverage, but Shadow Ball is definitely an option I respect.
That's good to know. And so, talk me through how you approach some common matchups in the metagame.
Okay. So let's take Swordfish, for example. Fairly standard Zacian, Kyogre. Let's say they have Grimmsnarl, Zapdos, Rillaboom, very much like my finals matchup. It'll change a little bit if they're the more offensive Whimsicott versions, because you have to assume that Whimsicott is going to have Taunt, which means going for a turn 1 Trick Room is a little bit more difficult. Normally, against those types of teams, you want to either lead like Incineroar Porygon 2, Incineroar Reshiram, or Reshiram Porygon 2. The thing is, Kyogre actually deals surprisingly little damage to a Dynamax Assault Vest Reshiram, and once Reshiram has set up the sun with Max Flare, it just gets even harder for the Kyogre player to deal with you. The big question that I think you really have to ask going into that matchup is, does the opposing Zacian have Substitute? If the answer is no, I really, really like Gameplans where you just lead the Reshiram, max at turn 1, start firing off damage, because you threaten Zacian in a way you don't if they can just sub turn 1, sub turn 2, sub turn 3, and then play towards a late game Trick Room where you have your Cali Ice, your P2, and your Incineroar all kind of preserved to deal damage. The thing you have to be careful about there is if they preserve their max or if they just preserve their Kyogre well enough, it can be difficult to deal enough damage to Kyogre because, Calyrex Ice is only hitting it for neutral damage with high horsepower, and Glacial Lance, while still strong, isn't always dealing the amount of damage you want to opposing Kyogre. This is one of the places where Eerie Impulse on Porygon 2 can come in very helpful because certainly Kyogre resists Glacial Lance, but if you get off an Eerie Impulse, you're still getting fairly positive damage trades. The other option is, depending on their Kyogre set and how they're choosing to play the matchup, you can just lead Regieleki. Max Lightning will OHKO basically all Zacian, and then in electric terrain, you're going to KO all non-Assault Vest Kyogre. You do have to be careful. If you say, for example, Max Lightning to KO a Zacian, you get your electric terrain, yay, you now KO Kyogre, and they just send in Rillaboom and reset your terrain. You've got to kind of consider what Pokemon they have on the team, what they're likely to be bringing, and what sort of lines they're likely to pursue. But it is an option. If they're 4 HP, like Mystic Water Kyogre, then Regieleki's Max Lightning is a 43.8% chance to OHKO them if they Dynamax. So it's something, but it was never an option that I personally felt compelled to go for, and I tried to avoid it. That was actually why I didn't Dynamax my Regieleki in Game 1 on turn 1, because I thought it was simply too likely that the Kyogre was going to Dynamax, I wouldn't be able to KO it, and I expected to double up into my Regieleki, which I wasn't actually right about, but just something to keep in mind. Against, Yveltal Zacian teams, Incineroar, P2 is a very strong lead, fairly straightforward, fake out if you feel it's necessary because you think max the Yveltal. If not, you could just go for parting shots to get in either your Cali or your Reshiram. And then you really do want to leverage those Trick Room turns to try to deal enormous amounts of damage. Because most of the time I would expect them to be Life Orb Yveltal, If they reveal their Assault Vest in game 2 or 3, I might, take it back a notch, play a little bit of a slower game plan because, they're obviously trying to play a slower game plan themselves. And I guess the one other team I will cover is Rinya Sun. This team does not have a good Rinya Sun matchup. Not at all. I did not play a single Rinya Sun, and I am glad I didn't because I am not convinced I would have been able to win. The theory is that if you lead like Reshiram P2, they're probably going to lead Groudon and Charizard because our team doesn't have a great way to deal with Groudon or Charizard. The idea is that you bait a Max Flare into the Porygon 2, you switch into Incineroar, you max the Reshiram, you throw a Whirlwind at the Charizard to deal a lot of damage, you get the double Intimidate, as it were, on the Groudon. First, the actual Intimidate from Incineroar, and then the Max Whirlwind to drop. And then, depending on how much they took from the Whirlwind or what they chose to do on turn 1, you can just stay with your Incineroar if it survived, go for a Fake Out Whirlwind, get your P2 back in on the next turn after you KO'd their Charizard, set up Trick Room, and then Caliace kind of cleans the endgame. Or alternatively, you might have to switch back into like Caliace to go for a Protect and take an uncomfortable amount of damage. It's just kind of rough. And that's one of the concerns I would have with this team going forward, which is that it is kind of meta-dependent, and if you expect to see a lot of Sun, I would not recommend this team at all.
Okay, that's good to know. And so I guess the other team that you didn't really talk about is various different Shadow Rider teams. How did you approach those matchups?
So for the Shadow Rider teams, it kind of depends. In general, before this past weekend, I would say that Shadow Rider ran one fairly consistent set, which was Astral Barrage, Snarl, Will-O-Wisp, and Protect. That's not a huge issue. You can just kind of lead Reshiram and deal large amounts of damage. Sure, Astral Barrage hurts a little bit, but you're Assault Vest. You don't mind too much. Snarl's annoying, but as long as you don't Dynamax too early, that's fine. -1 Blue Flare should still be KOing opposing Zacian, so you're in a good spot. And those teams can kind of struggle to prevent Trick Room. So if they are the Thunderous variant, I'd be inclined to lead perhaps Reshiram Porygon 2. If they're a Regieleki variant, I might be more inclined to lead Incin Porygon 2. Sometimes you can even just lead Regieleki into those teams. Say, for example, they're a Blastoise variant. One of the funny things you can do is lead Regieleki plus a partner of your choice, maybe Porygon 2, maybe Reshiram. Turn 1, if you think they're going to max the Blastoise, you can just max your Lucky, throw Max Lightning into their Blastoise, and pivot out to your Calyrex Ice. As one contains Unnerve, which will disable the Wackenberry that the Blastoise is presumably holding, and they just lose their max turn 1, which in most cases means they simply lose the game. Basically, the long and short of it is, Porygon 2 is very difficult for Calyrex Shadow teams to deal with, even at the best of times. And when you have the ability to pivot around between that, Incineroar, and Reshiram, you can place enormous amounts of pressure because they need to expend resources they can't afford to use to deal with one of those Pokemon. So, maybe they Dynamax their Calyrex Shadow, and if they're an Expanding Force version, they go for Max Mindstorm, they pick up a KO on P2 they wouldn't otherwise. Okay, now I send in Incineroar. Or, they dedicate their resources to removing Incineroar, and now Porygon 2 can clean up the endgame. The specifics will vary depending on how the game plays out and depending on what your opponent is prioritizing, but in general, I do think that is quite favorable for this team. And versus other kind of strange Calyrex Shadow Rider archetypes, say, for example, Calyrex Shadow Rider Groudon, you can do very much of the same. Instant, P2 are just fantastic in that matchup, and Caliace can very easily clean those endgames up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I guess I will touch on one thing, which is what I had to do versus Carson in my top 8 set. He was running a Choice Specs Calyrex Shadow Kyogre team, which isn't something I had given much thought to in building or prepping with this team. Fortunately, I played that matchup in top 8, which meant I had a night to prepare for it. And what I ended up doing was leading Reshiram Incineroar all 3 games, with the goal of going for a max flare and a parting shot, or somehow pivoting my Incineroar out. Every time it turned out that my Incineroar just got OHKO'd by either a max geyser or a water spout. But then what I was able to do is get my Caliace onto the field and go for Trick Room. And then because he was a very, very offensive team, he just kind of lost. He couldn't deal with my Dynamax restricted my Caliace under Trick Room. Now, if you were to be running the good version of this team that doesn't have Trace on Porygon 2, you should be switching in Porygon 2 and setting up Trick Room with that, because it's even more difficult for them to stop. Unfortunately, I had Trace, which risked tracing Drizzle. In fact, if they sent out the Calyrex, it was guaranteed to trace Drizzle because As1 is an untraceable ability. So that forced me into what would otherwise have been a suboptimal game plan. Ultimately, I was still able to pull that matchup out, but that matchup is one of the primary reasons why I heavily, heavily recommend that if you want to run a team like this, that you drop Trace from Porygon 2.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue to you want to talk about some of the matchups that you played over the course of the tournament, or any notable games that you had?
Sure, I'll talk about a couple of things. I was expecting that the Indianapolis meta would probably be more of the same. You know, Rainier Sun, fairly standard Swordfish compositions, maybe some Groudon teams that decided they want to run Venusaur. I knew Lunadon was picking up a little in popularity, so maybe a round or 2 of that. And that is not what I faced. I had 4 Yveltal Zacian teams, which was very fortunate for me because I have a very good Yveltal Zacian matchup. I only lost to one of them, and that was Monkey, who in game 1 Max Darkness crit me on turn 1, and then Max Darkness crit me on turn 2, and then Max Darkness crit me on turn 3. So game 1 was kind of a wash. Game 3 ended up being kind of close. The early rounds in which I did play Kyogre Zacian, I played a few of them, weren't too bad, but that really is a matchup that can go either way, as I think finals demonstrated. And that's another one of my kind of concerns with the team, and I guess with Calyrex Ice Rider kind of in general. The way I have it built as a weakness policy set, you do have incredible power and potential under Trick Room, but that can also force you into being kind of read dependent, right? Because if you, dedicate yourself to setting up Trick Room, you self-proc the weakness policy. In my experience, if you don't manage to win the game before that first Trick Room expires, you can be in a lot of trouble. And standard Swordfish compositions do have ways to stall Trick Room, because you're forced to commit moves into the Zacian to get a KO. If you don't, very much like Stefan did, he could just go for a Behemoth Blade into my Cali, and if I hadn't protected, I would have lost my Cali in the game. But alternatively, if I Max Quake, and he switches in a Zapdos, or switches in a Rillaboom, he's burning valuable turns that can be very, very difficult for me to address and respond to from my end. So it kind of becomes a game of chicken. Who's going to go for the hard read, and who's going to try to play defensively in front of it. In the early rounds of regionals, when you're playing more timid players, I didn't find it to be an issue. But in Top Cut versus more confident, more seasoned players, it's definitely something of a concern for the team. And then other matchups I faced in Swiss. Let's see. I did play a Kali Shadow Rider Zacian team that Cedric, the Floppy Mudkip, was using. Going into the set, I had been told that he was a Choice Specs Calyrex. He was actually Focus Sash, or at least I think he was. And he had Indeedee, which turn 1, game 2 allowed him to Helping Hand Max Quake KO my Incineroar because he Dynamaxed his Calyrex. And then because he was a slightly more defensive team than Carson Confer's top 8 team, even though I got Trick Room up, I didn't have the resources to blow through him. So the lesson from that set was, you really do have to preserve your resources to the greatest extent you can, and recognize when your opponent's team and your opponent as a player will be able to kind of weather out a Trick Room versus when Trick Room truly is just a win condition in and of itself.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I noticed using Calyrex Ice as well. Sometimes you get to win in your first Trick Room. Sometimes you have to really play a little more methodically to try to set it up a second time. That's a great example of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are all the questions that I had about the team. Did you have any final words or shout outs that you wanted to give?
Sure. So I would like to give shout outs to my immediate team building group, which is Ashton Cox, Luca, and now Zachary Thornburg, who's just come back to the scene. Techno Z has been assisting us with building. And as you mentioned earlier in the stream, this team was initially built for my NPA semifinals match against Gavin. So in the team building chat, a number of members of the puppies kind of helped me work through things in the transition from the initial Zacian Rillaboom build to the final Reshiram Tapu Fini build I ended up using. I think I would have had a much, much, much less successful weekend if I had rolled up with Zacian and Rillaboom. So that help was greatly appreciated.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on your second place finish. A really, really impressive performance at what might end up being the biggest events of the year. And for those of you who are interested in trying out Calyrex Ice Reshiram, this is the perfect team to try it out with. The rental code is, of course, on screen right now. The paste will be in the description down below. And yeah, thank you all for watching. And until next time, I will see you all